I am Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susie.
And we're paranormal specialists who live in the most haunted city on earth, Savannah, Georgia. Every day is Halloween in our line of work, so join us as we spin true tales of haunts, murders, and disturbing Savannah history. I'm Madison.
I'm Chris.
And welcome to the most haunted city on earth. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to like, comment, or subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure to go ahead and give us a 5-star rating so that we can continue bringing you great content. Stay spooky, y'all. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Most Haunted City on Earth. My name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susie.
And today we are joined by Noah from Real Hauntings. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I was in town this weekend and reached out to Madison, who had been a guest on my podcast, Real Hauntings Podcast. Also, you can find it as Real Hauntings, Real Ghost Stories. We did that for the SEO 3 years ago. Never
gotta know your numbers. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I love Savannah, obviously. I have lived in Atlanta for, almost 14 years now, maybe even a little longer, and had never been to Savannah until I moved to Atlanta. And then once we started the podcast about 3 or so years ago, of course, just kept hearing about Savannah, most haunted place in the country, most haunted place in the world, and met Madison through the podcast. Once we kind of expanded during COVID, we started using Zoom more, and we're able to bring people on from really everywhere, but especially in places like Savannah. And yeah, so happy to be here. We love having people on to share their real ghost stories, and hopefully I can do some of that for you guys today.
Absolutely. And before we get into that, I do want to say, if you are watching on YouTube, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share, do all the things, press all the buttons. That helps us get our podcast out even more, share the word, the good news of the ghostly podcast world. And if you are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure to give us a 5-star rating if you feel so inclined. Also, Connect Savannah voting for Best Local Podcast. We were nominated, and voting is now closed. So thank you guys so much for voting, and they will be announcing the winners of that on May 10th, I believe. So we'll let you know if that worked out for us in our favor. But let's go ahead and dive right on in. So Noah, y'all kind of do a different take on your ghost podcast. You kind of take a little bit more of a comedy sort of perspective, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so the way ours came together, I was at a theater where we did improv up until, I think maybe 6 months ago. I stopped doing live comedy. I've got a 3-year-old, so all the live comedy takes place at my house now. But there were 2 people, Kat and JJ, that I loved performing with, but I felt like I wasn't getting enough time making content with them, and I had this idea of doing a podcast. I have been really into podcasts for a long time and love long form interviews and that kind of stuff. So reached out to them and was like, okay, I knew JJ was skeptic about everything.
Right.
Kat's a really fun person, and I'm about to say spirit, but I don't that goes over in our world. But yeah, so I was like, guys, let's do this. Let's start a podcast where we interview people about their real hauntings, their real life ghost stories, and they were both game, right from the take. And kind of our niche in this niched field was that at that time we were all skeptics, but on very different scales, right? Mm-hmm. I had some experiences. Kat had some experiences. JJ doesn't even know what it's like to be driving his car and feel and feel somebody staring at him from the car over. He's like, I don't believe that's a thing. And I was like, JJ, it happens to people all the time. It's he's like, nope, deja vu isn't real. None of it's real. And it's like, okay. So that's where we started. And, we've been doing it for a couple years now. And we all have significantly risen, spoiler alert, if you're just going to start with our podcast.
Right.
But we've significantly rose on our, what we call the Believo meter, 0 meaning you don't believe in ghosts, 10 you absolutely do. And you can't help it because you have all these people on, tell their endearing ghost stories. A lot of them are really scary, which is why I think the three of us having a comedy background helps give it some levity where it surprised me the amount of people that are like, oh gosh, I can't listen to some episodes because they're too scary. I just like feeling alive and like always chasing the dragon of being on stage and creating. So being scared is like another one of those kind of fun emotions. But yeah, there are a lot of people who really, we found out, need that little bit of comedy, need those dad jokes, need Kat making fun of me for making dad jokes,
Sure.
you know, those kind of things. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's kind of where we got started.
That's awesome. Yeah, I totally get what you mean, where some people need like a little bit of comedy there. That's kind of what JT provides, you know, because JT kind of got thrown into the fire of ghost stuff by marrying me.
Yes.
And so he's like, okay, I can provide some comedic relief, you know, to Chris and I's, you know, being like, well, you could have an entity attached to you and blah, 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 blah. So, but I love the concept of skeptics, you know, talking about paranormal experiences because it is a really different perspective than us who automatically are like, I'm going to assume that you had this experience and I'm going to believe you because it's better to just, you know, believe somebody in their stories. But skeptics are so staunch sometimes, you know?
Well, and I was going to say, I think it's really cool that you move the gauge at all, because some people identify themselves as skeptics and do not allow themselves any room for growth because it's a brand. You know, being a skeptic is a brand that you would feel strange to step away from in any, you know, in even the smallest amount, because that's what you're selling. You're selling, you know, the skeptic's view. But you're right. You can't listen to story after story from people who are sincere and who are terrified or who have these instances and just assume, well, this is nonsense, you know?
Yeah, and, you know, for us, when we first started, we were doing everything really local. It was all very local to Atlanta. Being in the theater community, as you guys know, it was a wealth of people who had experienced supernatural things or experiences. And so we literally started with bringing our friends on, and you're like, I really know this person. I know they're not here for clout or glamour. They're just sharing their story. Especially then, we were getting like 50 downloads a week. You know, it wasn't where it is now. And so you just go, well, I know they're telling the truth about their experience. I believe them about everything else they tell me. So maybe this is real. And it just builds and builds and builds.
Right. So what's one of the craziest paranormal stories that you've ever heard?
Yeah, so there's a couple on our podcast, but there's one specifically, I should say, that if there was an award for podcasters, like if we got potties or something, I don't know what they would call it, this is the one I would submit for our podcast. We had a guest on, and I think the episode title is something like, it was something about the ghost trying to get her kid to believe that it was her. I would have to look specifically. I can give it to you guys if you want to tag it in the comments. But basically, it was a very emotional episode. It dealt with physical abuse in a relationship. It dealt with having a young child witnessing some of this stuff. And it dealt with the supernatural kind of saving her and her kid, and another entity trying to get her kid to like go out into the woods and go out into traffic and arrive itself at a point where it was looking like her. It was a doppelganger, essentially, an evil doppelganger, almost like
there's the key word, doppelganger,
right? And it almost looked like it was from like The Ring or something. Just to make a long story short, she was in this bad relationship. They moved into this place in Atlanta and started having supernatural stuff happening. And the kids started being like, just talking in the room, and the mom would walk by and be like, who are you talking to? And there was this ghost that was an older gentleman, and he kept, I don't remember the ghost's name, but it was like, oh, I'm seeing Matt. She kept hearing, she's like, oh, okay. Until one day, she actually saw a spirit. And she was like, okay, there's something more going on here. And then she heard the child talking to her, but she wasn't in the room. and it was very negative stuff, and that kept going on. And then they were hearing noises from the home. They actually left the home, and as soon as they walked out of the door locked. And they couldn't get back in. And then the neighbors would hear somebody screaming inside the home when they weren't there. So it's just a lot of, like, you guys know, hearing stories, a lot of cues, a lot of buzzers going off, right? And the coolest thing, and I'm not going to spoil it because it is one of those endings of a story that is truly gratifying, but basically the Matt character used to be a shop owner where a mechanic shop. And so it was like this just very warm guy, and he helped the child, one, retrieve keys that were too high up for the child to get to. The mother had been kind of knocked down unconscious, and so the child was able to retrieve the keys, retrieve the phone, and call 911, all at the instructions of the spirit.
Wow.
And something happens at the end that lets us all know that this spirit was real. It's something that if these people are telling the truth, it's undeniable. And you know what? I'm just going to spoil it because what am I here for? I'm not going to leave you guys hanging. They were so all this stuff takes place. They move, they get out of the bad relationship, they get in a safe place, right? So they go to this diner in a rural part of Georgia outside of the city. And the kid is like, they're sitting there eating, and there's like truck stuff everywhere, car stuff. I can just imagine taking my 3-year-old. He would love this, right? Mm-hmm. And the kid looks over, and he's like, oh, hey, Mom, there's Matt. Now she's thinking like, oh, the spirit's here with us. My kid's seeing the spirit. And she's like, oh, okay. He's like, no, look, there he is. And they look up, and it's like Matt's Automotives.
Oh, wow.
And there's the guy right there. And so she immediately is like, waitress, who is that? Where is that? How can I get there? And she's like, oh, that doesn't even exist anymore. You know, that place was torn down, and this is like one of the last artifacts of that place. And so they go home, and she literally sees the spirit leaving her son's room one last time, and him just kind of like giving her a little nod. And
that's cinematic.
It is
what that is.
I know. And I told her, I was like, you got to write a book. You got to write a screenplay. You got to do something.
Absolutely.
Right? So that, to me, that's our best episode. Just as somebody who loves being a storyteller, interviewing people, I mean, it was perfect.
It is.
So that was a great one.
That is such a cool story. I mean, I love those types of stories. They're very rare.
Yes.
You know, when spirits interact in that way, because typically spirits are very about kind of what their, needs are. Because obviously, humans are very just self-oriented in general. And when you're in the afterlife and you only have so much energy to expend, it's natural for them to be like, okay, I need to do this. I need to do this. It's so rare to see spirits that are like, I'm going to help somebody while I'm here,
Yeah, we had people writing in saying they were moved to tears listening to that episode.
Oh, it's a beautiful story.
And it was one of those things. And another thing we hear a lot, which wasn't necessarily the purpose of the podcast, but it's kind of turned into that, is that people feel like it's a safe space to come share their stories because they have sat at home for so long, keeping all this built up with nobody to relate to. And then they find, like a podcast like yours or ours, and they're like, oh gosh, this is me, and then they get to come have their moment, which I love that part of it. When you can really see the relief come through somebody as they go from having kind of a shaky voice at the beginning of the podcast, and then they really get into their own, sharing their story.
Absolutely. Well, and we've talked about that before too, where, a lot of our listeners kind of have the same sentiment because we do live in a world where if you believe in the paranormal or you share your paranormal experiences, there's a million people out there to trying to discredit you or, trying to beat you down for having that experience, even though really, like, to the person, it's very real, you know?
Absolutely.
And so it is important to create those types of spaces where people can discuss them, especially for people who have very intense paranormal experiences. Because I'm sure, like, the woman you were talking about, that's like a story that would freak a lot of people out to disclose into public, you know, so.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, so this is one of the more unusual things that has happened on the podcast that has affected us directly. We had Amanda on. She's, oh gosh, at the time she was 19. She's probably 21 now, but she came on, and she's one of these people that sees spirits everywhere. Like, she will open the door for a spirit thinking it's a person. They walk through and people were like, what are you doing? She's like, oh, sorry. And she shared a bunch of interesting stories about how that affected her growing up, how her mother took holy water from the church thinking that, you know, she could exorcise this demon presence in her life and things like that. Fascinating story, really interesting person. But at the end of it, Kat, who is one of the co-hosts of the podcast, she was like, well, have you seen anything as we've been talking? And so she's like, yeah, there's been this older lady behind you. She's smoking a cigarette. She's in like a bathrobe. And she kept describing it, and Kat was like, that sounds like my grandmother. It's really weird. And then from that point to, I don't know, maybe even like 4 or 5 months after that, periodically there would be this ghost lady voice that would bleed through into the podcast. Oh. And we didn't notice it at first. It was fans being like, hey, check minute so-and-so and so-and-so. And I edit it, which I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't pick up on it right away. But when I went back, the first time I heard it, it freaked me out so much that I threw the headphones off my head. And it's like a, you know, like one of like a parcel tongue kind of shit. And it's really freaky. And there were like 3 or 4 really pronounced times. And then after that, I stopped pulling it and bringing attention to it because I didn't want it to seem like, oh, this is the focal point of our podcast. We're the podcast that has the ghost lady, you know? So I was like, if it's there, it's there. If it's not, it's not. But for that period, it was really strange. We had JJ's brother on, who's even a bigger skeptic than he is, and he will let you know it kind of
of course.
Individual. And he was making fun of us about that. And literally you go to that episode and you can start hearing that lady like try to talk through. But the most interesting one, because we were like, maybe it's like a Zoom interference thing going on or whatever, but Kat and JJ heard it out loud in their home. We were recording. This lady was telling us about her haunted cabinet or something. I don't remember exactly. And I'm interviewing her, and like I've always got like one eye down on Kat and JJ, one on the guest, trying to keep everything organized. And I see Kat and JJ just start turning and looking at each other, and they're like, you know, just like moving their mouths. And I'm like, what are they doing? This is so distracting. And then I'm finally like, hey guys, are you okay? And they're like, we heard it. We heard it right here. The noise out loud. And I was like, okay, this is weird. And in recording, like as soon as we were done that episode, I went back and listened to it. You could hear it clear as day.
Wow.
So that's a little fun ditty for people who start and work their way through. We haven't heard it in a long time. They've actually just moved too, so I don't expect we will hear that noise, but who knows? You never know what you're going to get when you live in the supernatural world all the time.
It's so true. I mean, we've had more paranormal experiences start to happen in this space since we've started this podcast because, you know, definitely because we talk about ghosts so much that they're like, hey, these people like us, you know, we're going to make our presence known.
Your brain needs support, and new Ollie Brainy Chews are a delightful way to take care of your cognitive health. Made with scientifically backed ingredients like Thai ginger, L-theanine, and caffeine, Brainy Chews support healthy brain function and help you find your focus, stay chill, or get energized. Be kind to your mind and get these nootropic chews at ollie.com. That's OLLY.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
So it's interesting to hear that y'all like are starting to get that same experience where since you're talking about the supernatural so often and the paranormal, you're starting to bring them out a little bit. Yeah. Have there been other times where that's happened?
Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of start with my experiences, because there's really only two really pronounced ones, and there's some smaller ones we don't have to get into. But the one that kind of starts the origin of the podcast, episode 1, is from when I was 13, and then I'll jump to the one that just happened over Halloween in Vegas. So I've really had two experiences,
there you go.
like 20 plus years apart.
But you sandwiched them, right?
Yes.
It's very strange. But the one when I was younger, so I grew up in Mississippi in a very small town, like 15,000 people. And one of my best friends when I was growing up, he grew up in a legitimate mansion, very old money Mississippi mansion. All the things that you can imagine that went with that, go with that. Mm-hmm. Now, they also had like an elevator in the home that nobody used, but it would randomly turn on in the middle of the night and just ka-da, ka-da, and we'd be like, what is going on? And he had an older sister who'd be like, it's the devil, you know, like, great. That's helpful for me as a very impressionable young child. But he had a sister that was just like a year younger than us that we would play with, and she would have a friend over or whatever, and we'd all play together. So we're like 10 or 11, and we were playing hide and go seek in the home. And the way we would do it, his bedroom, we would go in, turn off all the lights, and it was like a giant bedroom. And then whoever was it would count, as you do in hide and seek, and everybody else would hide. But our variation was you couldn't move once you had hidden, and so the person had to go through the room and try to find, and you get scared, right? Somebody would be like, you know, whatever. So I was it. I counted, came into the room. And this memory is as clear as day to me, but I've told the story like a bajillion times now. So I imagine more of the story as the memory now. So I give that as kind of like, you know, take it as what you will. But I went in and I saw one of them take off running across the room. And I was like, cheater. You know, so as a little kid, I was like, I'm going to really get him. And I went to like put my arm through and tag them like really hard to be a jerk. And then my arm went right through them. Was not them. They like it turned its head like this and looked at me, and it had like kind of reflective eyes, kind of like a Jawa, like a small, or I guess Jawas are small. That's but yeah, and so we all screamed, ran out of the room, went to their playroom, turned on all the lights, and just sat there. Didn't really talk about it anymore. Fast forward, my friend used to come pre-pandemic. He would come see me in Atlanta like every 4 years or so. We'd go to a concert, kind of catch up. He lives in Florida now. And the last time he did was prior to me starting the podcast, but I was like, hey, do you remember when we were kids and we had that weird, and he was like, where you tagged the ghost? And I was like, yeah. He was like, yeah, I talk about it all the time. And I was like, okay. So that made me feel like something took place, right? So that's kind of the antithesis of me being curious in the supernatural, that whole thing. Fast forward to my wife and I went to Vegas for When We Were Young Fest over Halloween. So we were there Thursday, Friday, Saturday, flew back Sunday. And Friday night, we went to a party at the Palms Casino. It was 80s, 90s theme, and we went as Beetlejuice. And so she did like a gender bender Beetlejuice. I did the traditional one. Super fun. We love Dragon Con, for those of you that are familiar with that. So we enjoy cosplay and that kind of stuff. So we were all dressed up, went, had a great time. Didn't overdo it partying. I mean, we are getting older. You know, for us, that vacation turned in more to like, we can just sleep as long as we want, not having our kid here. And so went and had fun, came back, probably went to bed around like 1:30. So I woke up, and I'm a very light sleeper. So I remember waking up, looking at the like, you know how like hotels will have, you know, like the clocks where you can see or whatever. And we were staying at Mandalay Bay, which has its own crossed recent history. That's kind of a bummer. This was not related to that, but just to keep that in mind. So I woke up, looked over, it was 3 a.m., and I was like, oh, man, okay, I got to go back to sleep. And as my eyes were kind of like moving, I saw this child ghost just staring at me. Fully, full-formed apparition. I could tell it wasn't like an alive boy in our room. It was, the way I described it, it like wasn't fully in color, if that makes sense. But yeah, it was just staring at me like I was a fish in a fishbowl kind of thing. And I was like, okay, I get sleep paralysis sometimes. I don't have it nearly as frequent as I used to. my traditional sleep paralysis is I see a spider dropping down on my face.
God.
Usually related to anxiety, but rarely since Lexapro, thank God, does it happen anymore. But I was like, okay, I must be having sleep paralysis. There's not a little boy staring at me. So I said, I'm going to roll over. And then I rolled over and I was like, can't do that in sleep paralysis. So I was like, either sleep paralysis is over or let me see what's going on. So I rolled back over and there he was, just staring at me, just clear as day. He looked kind of old-timey, maybe like 20s era garb, like when it was cool to make children work, you know, that kind of thing. And now at this point, I'm really starting to freak out. My wife is a huge skeptic. I'm not even going to waste my time waking her up. Also, like, maybe some of your viewers or listeners have experienced this kind of stuff. For me, it was so overwhelming. It wasn't like I could be like, well, I'm going to do these 3 things to pinpoint what's happening. It was more just like, do I pull the covers over my head and scream into my pillow? What do I do? So I rolled over one more time and was trying to kind of gather myself. And I was like, okay, I'm going to roll over again and prove to myself that this thing is not there. So I rolled over. Not only was it there, now there was an older man with like its hand placed on the kid's shoulder. To me, very clearly representing like the father. Same garb, you know, that kind of deal. Sorry, it's a weird thing, and it's like bringing, because it's still like kind of recent, you know, to talk about. But so I kid you not, the thing I've heard so many people talk about on my podcast that I never understood. I pulled the covers over my head and finally went to sleep, whatever. So I woke up immediately, told my wife, I was like, you're not going to believe what happened. There was a ghost, there was a kid, and she was like, okay, Real Hauntings, calm down. And, like, went about her morning, and I was like, so yeah, that really happened. And for at least 2 months after that, I would get ready to go to bed at my own home. In my bed, I would close my eyes. I couldn't really see the guy in my memory, but the kid, I think because I have a young kid, was just clear as day in my eyes. And it was really strange. The first time I talked about it on Real Hauntings, I had a medium on. Her name is Catherine. She has a podcast called Murder and Mediumship. She co-hosts with me a lot. And I didn't ask for like a reading or anything during the podcast, but she was just like, to me, that really feels like it. They were from the Mormon era of Nevada when they settled before like all the casinos and stuff. Now, I don't know a ton about Mormons. I did watch that detective show on Hulu, and I was like, yeah, that fits 100%, So I don't know, but those are kind of my 2 big experiences. My family has had like some intuition stuff, premonition stuff. I will share this one because it's a little strange. My mom had a dream when I was a kid that our cousin, who was near her age and like her best friend growing up, that he and his wife and their kids were in a car, had a wreck. This would have been Christmas Eve, and that she passed away, the wife. My mom woke up crying and was like, oh, I just had this awful dream, yada, yada. Phone rings. It really happened. Now that I experienced in real time, I recently verified it again with my mom that really happened, and she actually went ahead and shared some more stuff with me where she recently got to meet some celebrities through her work, and I won't bore you with the details of that, but the day before that happened, she had a dream about who they were going to be, and it was those people. Oh, wow. So she has some funky stuff going on. Sure. My dad, same way. Both of them are very like conservative types that wouldn't necessarily talk about like hauntings and that kind of stuff. Yeah. But because this has become so much of my life, they feel so much more comfortable now sharing that. So yeah, that's I guess a little ditty into my life.
Absolutely. Well, those are all like fascinating stories, truly, in very different ways too. The one for Las Vegas, I think, is really interesting. Just because I feel like Las Vegas doesn't get the notoriety of being haunted in the way that they are. I mean, Nevada in general is such a haunted place. Right. With just kind of being an area that just exudes the perfect atmosphere for paranormal. And I don't know, I guess I'm not as familiar with Mormons either. You know, I don't know if that necessarily sticks, but to me it felt like almost they were acknowledging that you're a father, you know, and a lot of times spirits come through to certain people because they relate to you in a way. Right. You know, because a lot of times, you know, parents are the ones that experience children ghosts the most because they see, they can sense that you have that instinct in you and they feel comfortable around you. So it makes me wonder, you know, if that was just them being like, oh, like we like him, you know, or
I hope so.
Yeah.
They didn't stick around, so
right.
that's good. They didn't jump in my luggage and come home with me. That's always the thing you know, you hear in these stories, like, I went to this place and now this thing's a part of my life. I'm like, I don't need that. I've got enough part of my life.
It's going to be hard to pull a spirit away from Vegas.
Yeah.
You know? And it's interesting because Vegas is just this giant 24-hour battery. You know, it's just lit up all the time, all this electricity, all this power, surrounded by nothing. So as you move away from Vegas, you've got, you know, hundreds of miles of emptiness, of nothingness. So if there are spirits that are just roaming about, don't have a home, don't have a reason to, you know, actually haunt a place, they'll be drawn to that, you know, oasis of energy, you know, and so it may not have anything to do with that specific location or that specific hotel or anything of that nature. If you're talking about just, you know, the logistics of ghosts in Vegas, there's probably a lot of ghosts that have nothing to do with Vegas specifically. They're just drawn and collected there because it's this big, gigantic, you know, beacon of light in the in the dark.
And if you're one who believes that tragedy makes spirits, Lord knows.
Oh,
there's a history of Vegas.
Well, and that desert.
Absolutely.
The desert is such a tragic place. People trying to live there often end in horrible and terrible way. Just trying to traverse the desert in hopes of reaching some greener place oftentimes ended in absolute tragedy.
Yeah. For sure.
That's what I was going to say is we talk about the hardiness of certain ghosts in different areas. Do you know how hardy you got to be to last in the desert?
To call the desert home and be like, this is it. This is the place.
You know, it's that's the other thing is like, one, they're getting fed with all that energy constantly coming through, but also if they were able to survive for a period of time in the desert, they're tough cookies. So
they're tough cookies, and they'll remain.
They will. They'll stick around. They're those Midwest and lower, you know, ghosts. They are for real. But
absolutely.
I mean, just an interesting story too, and I feel like a lot of it too is because you're becoming more open to paranormal.
Oh,
so
yeah, absolutely.
They're gonna start to come to you more. I wouldn't be surprised if you had more paranormal experiences in the future.
I don't know. I feel like lately I'm seeing more things in the corner of my eye in my house, and I'm like, okay, I guess it's starting. Great. Let's see where this goes. And my kid definitely does the thing where he's like, the monster's in the corner of the room, Dad. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I shared this recently. So to help my kid combat whatever he thinks is whatever in his room that he doesn't want to deal with, he has a fan on the ceiling, right? And I was like, Bud, Mr. Fan is here. I mean, he gives us air, keeps us safe. He was like, Mr. Fan? And so I started doing a fan voice that's like, well, hi there. How are you? You know, very like 50s, like superhero or whatever, you know? And so now it has gotten to the point where he uses Mr. Fan as a procrastination tool before going to bed. He's like, can Mr. Fan tell me a race car story? And I'm like, what have I done? I have to do a story in the voice of this
fan.
Well, hopefully you chose a voice you can do easily.
Right.
You want to be all squeaky about it.
And as someone who loves improv now, when we go in different rooms, I've created voices for like other fans in the room, you know, and it's getting a little out of control. Luckily, he doesn't remember that for the other rooms. It's
a whole fan community coming into your house. Well, honestly, it's kind of genius though to make like an inanimate object kind of the protector for paranormal. You know how you were saying like you don't know why, and you always hear in stories people pulling the covers over your head. It's this false sense of security that we create for ourselves that I think we all develop even as children, you know, is it can't get to me if I'm underneath this. If I can't see it, it can't hurt me. You know, same thing with T-Rexes.
Kind of like it starts with peekaboo, right? It's like, you can't see me. You know, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. Yeah, I felt protected when I pulled those covers up from my head.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
You know, because it's like, well, if they can't perceive where I am, they can't get me.
I love the idea of the ghost being like, well, guess he's gone. Let's
Right.
go.
Exactly. Well, and it's like, and that's what children do too. You know, I mean, obviously it doesn't go away, but, you know, kids are notorious for being like, you know, oh, well, if I go under my sheets, they can't get me. Or the biggest superhero in the world, if I go to my mom or my dad, it definitely can't get me.
Right.
I know I was a kid that was like that. I drove my parents insane because I'd see spirits in my room, get freaked out, and I'd go to my parents and be like, there's a ghost. And they're like, oh my God, not another one. or I'll be like, and there's one in here too. And they're like, great, you know. But I was like, I'm with my parents. So like that ghost, you try to mess with my mom, you know, like good luck, buddy. It's not going to happen. Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting how we cope with the paranormal in that way.
Yeah, so I don't know about you guys, but the thing that fascinates me the most with the paranormal, is mediums and psychics. Because I grew up, the X-Men cartoon was like my favorite thing as a kid. I grew up with that Saturday block of cartoons. And the idea that there are people walking amongst us who can tap into something that the majority of us can't, which now I almost equate to people who can just pick up a guitar and play it without ever reading music. Like, I can't relate to that. You could say, I'll give you $1 billion, go do it, and keep your money. It's never going to happen. And so for a while, I have tried to develop relationships on the podcast with mediums. We'll certainly have interviewed them. And the ones that I feel like I trust as humans, I've tried to bring back as co-hosts, you know, just to kind of see what happens on episodes. And I'll share this with you guys because to me, this is one of the more fascinating things I witnessed on real time in Zoom, which is a funny thing to say. But so Catherine, who I mentioned earlier, she was on an episode with me. We were interviewing this lady who had lost her father. I can't remember exactly when, but I want to say, you know, maybe when she was in like her early 20s or maybe even a little younger. But so her and her father were close. She had some, I hate to use the word hauntings, but some arrivings of supernatural events that she was saying, I think this is my dad, these things are happening, X, Y, and Z. So I kind of like, I look at Catherine now as just like a friend. I don't see her as like a medium in my head. So I almost kind of forget during an episode, and I see her doing her thing where she's like, you know, like, right. And I'm like, what is she doing? And then I remember like, oh, okay, something's about to happen. You know, and she's like, hey, I want to ask you, and it's a sensitive question, but did your dad, was he like a beer drinker? And she was like, yeah. And she was like, well, I keep getting the smell of beer and hearing the crush of a can. And I think it was like a Bud Light can. I just keep hearing it. And then I see this guest in real time to start to cry. And she's like, that's my dad. The can, the crushing, the drinking. And that was one of those things, because there are a lot of ways to attack medium psychics, that type of person, you know, from, well, they read it on the internet. They sourced it out of you without you realizing it, that kind of stuff. And I'm sure that exists. I mean, there's a little bit of Slytherin in all of us, and some people have a lot of it, you know. But to just see her, and I didn't send her like show notes ahead of time. And even if I would have, that wouldn't have been in it. Like, why would she have told me that, you know, before the show? And that was one of those real moments for me that it just hit me so hard. Like, there is something else going on right now in this connection between this co-host, Catherine, and this guest. I'm not a part of it. Mm-hmm. I'm just a fly on the wall, and I'm witnessing this person feeling a super strong connection to her father again, and this other person knowing something they had no business knowing. And that's what I love about the supernatural and interviewing, is that I just continue to be surprised. It's just like it's never ending. Like, I'll think I have a tap on what's going on, and then the next episode I get blown away, which I'm sure you guys kind of experience the same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's so tricky with mediums because a lot of that started even in the 50s when, it was very popular to have psychics go on tour and do mass readings. And that was where the stigma came from because they did a lot of those ploys where they were taking information ahead of time or there were plants in the audience and things like that. But there are truly people who do have that type of ability. I envy them at times because I'm like, that's so cool, but I feel like it takes a very specific type of person to be able to perceive that information and translate it into a way that is helpful. Like it takes a special soul of sorts. And that's why those people specifically are gifted.
It's such a clean analogy to picking up a guitar and playing it by ear, because we can all hear and appreciate music, but we can't necessarily translate that into an action that produces music. Because there are plenty of people who have instances of mediumship or instances of clair activity, and then they don't know what to do with it. They can't make something of it. They can only experience it, and it doesn't become even like trying to formulate a question like I'm seeing, I'm feeling, I'm sensing. It's more like I've been overwhelmed by an event and I don't know what to do with that information. And they can only experience it. They can't really turn it into something that is utilized.
Absolutely.
Well, and it's special too that, so many mediums have been able to help people, and it's sad when people do negate a lot of people who are truly mediums because like I said, there are plenty of people who like to take advantage of certain situations, but it's sad when you negate those people who do have the abilities because they do truly help people feel reconnected to their loved ones. We get a lot of times people who will reach out and be like, how do I, like my husband passed away recently, or my mom passed away and I am dying for a connection, and we're like, it's not meant for us to help you with that sort of thing.
That's so funny you say that because that comes up in my normal life and with people who just tangentially know that I have this podcast and kind of involved, or am involved with the community. And the same thing, they'll ask me for that. I was like, yeah. And then I'll just never go back to it because I don't feel like it's my place to intervene in whatever that is,
Right. Well, and it's like, grieving is such a hard process, that's why there are counselors specifically trained to handle grieving. And, and like when you have a loved one pass away, you are so desperate to feel that connection again. So anytime, someone is related to the paranormal, it's like almost grasping, like, can you help me in this way? So, especially I get it a lot since that I see spirits and I hear spirits, but I'm like, I'm not a medium. They don't always utilize me for specific purposes. A lot of times it is they're looking for acknowledgement when they come to me specifically. So I don't have the ability to assist in that way, but I'll definitely have to get Catherine's information so we maybe can direct some of our listeners over to her.
It's been really interesting to hear from our community of fans who have reached out to her, and I never say like, go book an appointment. Like I just have her on. They can decide for themselves how they feel about it, And it's cool to hear back from them in a positive way. And she also does like some women empowerment classes that have like nothing to do with me, but kind of like this is how you start your own business. That that kind of stuff, and people really enjoy that too. But there's. I'm at a point where I feel pretty confident that the supernatural is real, and so now that that's my starting point. It's almost like a new revelation in the podcast. I'm not trying to so much prove to myself anymore through these stories. Now I just want to be a collector of these stories for the rest of the world. And, there are other podcasts like The Campfire that have been around for a long time. I got to do Jim's podcast not too long ago. And I knew of that podcast. I did not know how long he had been in the game. And for a while, I was like tricking myself, like, one day we're going to have the most ghost stories. I was like, yeah, I forget that.
Yeah, I know.
So, you know, and I think you guys have such a cool place in this, and I call it a niche because it is, but it's a really cool spot to find and be a part of this community, because you really do meet some people that are approaching this from an honest curiosity, from an experience point of view, all these things. And it's just, I can't see a time where I get tired of interviewing another person about something otherworldly that happened to them.
Absolutely. I mean, well, you know, and every paranormal experience is so different. Like, you're never going to get the same one with this with any person. And so it's always interesting. And sure, you can make connections, and you can say, like, well, maybe it's this catch-all term of whatever type of entity it is, but, you know, no two people are going to perceive in the same way. And on the sentiment of gathering ghost stories, that's kind of like what Chris loves about the paranormal.
Yeah, I have no interest in evidence or proof or anything of that nature, because that's highly subjective and highly, you know, anybody could do that. But good stories, you know, when people have taken the consideration of their experience and transformed it, because like you said, you tell the story of the tag game so often, but it does crystallize. It turns into something that is very solid and can be passed, you know, along. And then, you know, being a place where people feel safe to tell their stories is hugely important, because so many people, they're like, oh, my friends will think I'm crazy, you know, or, you know, or I think I'm crazy. You know, this is a crazy story, so I'm just going to ignore it, or I'm going to bury it. And to have a place where people aren't immediately being like, well, that's not true, or well, that's ridiculous, or, you know, because some stories are ridiculous. Some stories are beyond what you could easily believe. But when you take that step back and say, okay, but this is their story. You know, this is the story that they have brought, and you have to take into consideration the journey that got them to the chair. You know, how did they come to the story, and what does it mean? And if it's important enough to share, then you should treat it with enough respect to be like, okay, let's look at this story.
It's an interesting dynamic too between the supernatural and mental health. And you know, that's something that we have tried to work into our podcast from a purposeful standpoint of talking about our own mental health, you know, what's been good for us, whether it's therapy, medication, whatever. And I find that a lot of people have appreciated that as well, because so many people do come on and they're like, well, I feel crazy. I feel that, you know, you hear this word crazy thrown around a lot.
Absolutely.
And it always makes me a little sad as somebody who takes on other people's emotions.
Sure.
to feel that pain and hear them describe what life has been like for them through these experiences they can't explain. And I think there definitely are people, you know, obviously, that have mental illnesses that, you know, need traditional treatments for those things. And I hope they find the help they need. But if we can help people who have had supernatural experiences that their parents have told them they're crazy, they don't want to hear it. And a lot of that, what I found, stems from fear from the people around them, because if they accept that their friend, their daughter, their son, their husband, whatever, has seen a ghost, you know, I'll just take one from our podcast, seen a ghost that came into the bathroom while they were taking a shower and mimicked the voice of a little girl, and then when they opened it, it was the vision of a dead person, you know. Ooh. If they believe that is real without experiencing it themselves, then where do they stop believing something is not real? You know,
exactly.
like how far down that line do they go before they say, this is it, this is the stopping point? It's aliens. It's, you know, I can leave my body and float and see, you know, whatever it is. Like, how do they know where to stop? For me, it's not about knowing where to stop. It's about seeing where all I can go. Exactly. And I'm not here to tell you, like, this is real. This isn't real. First and foremost, I hope you're entertained. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you're curious. Beyond that, it's up to you. you know, I'm not your daddy.
Yeah.
You know, so be responsible, enjoy the information, and write in your ghost stories.
Absolutely. Send us your ghost stories, please. That's why we started the ghost mail segment, you know, because we love reading people's experiences. And we've had some that are sent in. We're like, that's insane. Yeah. And not in a bad way, but like just a crazy, you know, like sort of almost like movie-like situation. Yes. And so it's so fascinating to hear that because, you know, we've heard plenty of different people who are like, oh, you need to talk to this other person who's sent in because you guys have similar experiences. Right. Or, you know, people listening, they're like, oh, cool, somebody else had an experience like myself.
Well, that's the other interesting thing is when you start collecting ghost stories, you start to see patterns and you start to realize that this is a lot like this other group of ghost stories that we've heard. And this is a lot like this other group. And that creates this incredible like shared community of, you know, what is it that the small girl ghost, you know, how many people have encountered that?
The Hat Man.
And every time the Hat
Man.
Man.
Oh, the Hat Man.
We're all over the Hat Man. Son of a bitch.
I know.
How dare you, Hat Man? But yeah, the Hat Man, which is even more intriguing because I keep saying that every time I talk to somebody who's never heard of the Hat Man and I start talking about it, 9 times out of 10, they're like, oh, wait a minute. And there's something deep in the recesses of their memory of being like, I think I do know this, or I think I had this experience, or sleep paralysis, or whatever story that they have. It's fascinating how often how quickly they can go from I've never heard of that to being like, oh, tell me more.
Right.
You know, this kind of sparks some memory in my mind. So yeah, I find that endlessly interesting as well because a lot of times it's like I think that tells us about this universal human condition, this possible longing within us, or this understanding of the world that we don't have on paper, that's not not in the instruction manual. And when we encounter them, they find their way into these very clean slots, and you're like, wow. I always told people that, and I've interviewed thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in my life. The most common ghost story I get is on the night my blank died, they came to me in a dream.
Absolutely.
The night my grandmother died, or my uncle, or my best friend, or whatever, they came to me in a dream. I cannot tell you how many times I heard that story over and over and over again, and oftentimes it's the only story that people have. It's like, well, there is this one thing that happened. There is this one thing that I find interesting, and it's like I don't even register it anymore as a ghost story question mark.
Sure.
Of course that's a ghost story. Naturally that's a ghost story, and it's so common that it's a loved one, and it's so common that it's warm. It's so common that it's, the truth is we tell scary ghost stories because they're thrilling. The ghost stories that we overlook are these very moderate, calm ghost stories. People don't usually even come forward with their, because they're like, oh, well, my ghost story is boring. And it's like, it's not boring. It's fantastic when you think about it, but it's not high stakes.
Sure.
And it's not, grab the kids and run out of the house, kind of intensity, which a lot of people imagine makes up a ghost story is like the element of the ghost story is threat. The element of the ghost story is how scary it is. Yeah. In my experience, most ghost stories are not scary at all. They are usually loved ones reaching out.
Well, before we wrap up, and I'm not trying to, sounds like I'm trying to host your podcast. I don't know why I framed it like that, but I am curious to segue off what you were saying. Now that you guys have, you've been living this, but now that you've been doing this for a bit, is there anything that scares the two of you, or or do you just kind of accept it all now as it comes?
Honestly, I'm not scared of a lot of things. I hate dolls, though. I will stand by that. I will die on that hill.
You're gonna say dogs. I was like, weird take, but okay.
I love
German Shepherds.
Just honestly, no more German Shepherds. No, I love dogs. I'm actually very much so obsessed with them. But dolls, can't do dolls.
Okay.
I hate them so much. I was recently at the Paranormal Society of Savannah's horror con
last weekend, right?
Yep. And where they put my table, of course, was literally on this side of me, a really creepy haunted doll. On the other side of me, a really creepy haunted doll. I'm like, y'all did this on purpose.
So
like,
funny.
I'm like, that's just not
the
nice.
easiest things to get a hold of, haunted dolls.
I know.
I got one in the trunk of my car right now.
Well, and one of them had to wear a muzzle because she bites people.
Get outta
Nobody
here.
wants that.
Yo, come on. Like, and one of our junkies, he came by and he took a photo of the doll, and he was like, it's really funny that they put this across from Madison. I'm like, thank you guys. Thank you all for laughing in my misery.
Right.
But that would probably be the thing that scares
that's
me.
fair. Yeah.
Other than that, not really.
So I'm highly phobic. I'm afraid of so many things. It's and the supernatural is only like one region of my fears.
Okay.
And I attribute that to having an older sister, because my older sister literally just packed every fear conceivable into me. She told me all the stories. I still have a lingering fear of getting milk spilled on me.
Okay.
Because when
Not getting milked.
No, having milk having milk spilled on me.
Okay.
Because when I was very young, my sister convinced me that if you got milk spilled on you, you would smell like rotting milk for the rest of your life, and nothing can clean it off.
Okay.
So she used to chase me around the house with a cup of milk.
Let me tell you about watermelon seeds. No,
No. If you swallow it, they'll grow in. And she went to we had these medical journals in my house, and she showed me a picture of lungs, and she showed it was an illustration of lungs, and the brachials in the lungs. She said those are the branches of the tree if you swallow seeds.
Here.
Yeah, no, she was diabolic. She thought it through because she had to find this picture. She had to come up with a story. If I had, and this was a person who swallowed apple seeds, and an apple tree was growing inside of them. That's what she told me when she showed me a picture of lungs.
That is rough.
Yeah, she was. I think she just like sat with a journal and was like, "What else?
Yeah.
What else could I do?"
Gnomes without hats.
Yeah, dwarves without hats. Was her crowning achievement. Dwarves without. So imagine
those of you who missed that
7-year-old
one.
me sleeping in my bed. It's middle of the night. Who knows what time it is, but I'm asleep, and I'm awakened by my sister. 2 years older than me. Wake me up. I wake up. What? And she's like, Chris. I was like, what? She's like, dwarves without hats, Chris. Beware of dwarves without hats. And middle of the night, I'm like, what? And she's like, think of them. They're all twisted, and they're drooling. They have knives, and they're coming. I was like, what? It's like, dwarves without hats. And then she starts to walk away. Middle of the night. And so she gets to the door, and I'm like, wait. Why don't they have hats? And she just like turns her head and says, well, if they had hats, you'd see them over the edge of your bed, and leaves.
Are you afraid of the dark?
Well, and no, an addendum to that is 20 years later, I'm sitting with my sister, and I'm like, do you remember Doors Without Hats? Jen, do you remember doing that to me? And she's like, oh, yeah. And I was like, what's going on in your mind? And she's like, well, I just wanted to see if it was scary. And it was. I was like, yeah, it was very scary. And then she says, and you know what? I thought about it, and they could have hats if they were shorter.
Oh, my gosh.
I was just like,
She made an addendum.
yeah,
to
she made an addendum.
How kind of her.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Wow. Yeah, for me, it's aliens, which aren't supernatural, but that's the thing that kind of freaks me out the most.
And we've touched upon this before, is our concept of supernatural and our concept, there is a point of connection. There's a crossover because aliens absolutely exist in a incredulous place for society. It's very difficult to simply accept, and so there are people who are devout about it, and they've had experiences, and they tell their stories, and they have these things. And surprisingly, in a lot of paranormal circles, they are shunned. There is a border between ghosts and aliens. It's like, no, there's a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of crossover, really. And if you want to get into like interdimensional beings, or even discuss that in any way, shape, or form, what do you think ghosts are? It all kind of lives in the same world of the things we don't know. And we shouldn't be so picky, because I've known many alien enthusiasts who are like ghosts, bah, and many ghost enthusiasts are like aliens, bah.
That's true. Yeah, but for me, it was seeing E.T. at way too young of an age,
sure.
knowing that they can just mold in with your stuffed animals,
right?
You know, just be there.
Hide in a stack.
Couldn't handle
animals,
that.
yeah.
And then watching Unsolved Mysteries at too young of an age, and just hearing that theme music and being like, I can't wait to ruin my life. You know,
what am I going to be afraid of next?
Yeah, exactly. So that is just always stuck with me.
Yeah, that's fair, and it's so innocuous, you know, because it's such a wide field, and it becomes more and more difficult to separate because people have vastly different experiences, and you're like, oh.
Is there any cryptid that you wish was real? Like, I don't know if vampires count as a cryptid, but I wish that was a possibility.
Yeah. Vampirism, you know, what is it? Is it pyphoria? There's a disease that kind of mimics a lot of the conditions of vampirism. But yeah, I don't know that I would want vampires necessarily. You
didn't see True Blood and like, that's me,
right?
Bring it on.
I don't know. They all seem pretty miserable, you know.
Aren't we all?
Well, that's just it. It's like I like the tuxedo wearing vampires. Right. Like, I've got the castle, everything's great.
Right.
You know, it's like I got money to burn. I can buy an abbey in England and terrorize people. Not the Louisiana, you know, blood farmers who.
Yeah, absolutely. You would hate my alien story that basically I told on a couple podcasts ago, where I was a child sleeping in my bedroom, and I had a big window that if you roll over, because my bed was like right against the wall, and it was right to where I could look out the window. I look out in the middle of the night on my second story house and see like a glistening alien sort of figure standing out front of my window, because I heard it tapping on my window. Really fun. And TikTok is convinced that I have been abducted many times because, well, it's funny actually, because a lot of the signs of that, I've never really given it much thought, but I had these little scars, like little tiny, almost surgical looking scars on my ankles, both ankles, that I have no idea where they came from.
Like these? No, I'm just kidding.
I know. Yes, that's the top.
Unsolved Mysteries.
Exactly. But, you know, it's crazy because I'm like, I have these little scars, and I'm like, where did those come from? Like, and they literally look like tiny, tiny little incision marks. It's so weird. But TikTok is convinced. You know, they will convince you of a lot of things. Yeah. So it's
amazing how many people know everything.
I know, right?
Especially on the internet.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The internet gives them endless abilities,
endless possibilities. But multiple people actually saw that TikTok and were like, I've had a similar experience. So I was like, this is very curious.
That is an interesting thing, because the moment you can put out any experience, sometimes having that validation, having someone else be like, you know, that's very similar to something I experienced. That's very similar. You know, I think that's a great service to put people's minds at rest. Because if even one person's like, I've had that experience, you know, you suddenly feel a little validated, you know, seen.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. But thank you, Noah, for joining us today. This has been such a fun conversation.
I'm trying to think. I think this is the first podcast I have done in person since the pandemic.
Wow.
So thank you all.
Well, we're honored
for letting me feel like a real live person.
A real person.
And I get to do some in-person comedy, which I haven't done in 5 or 6 months, which was great. And yeah, make sure if you're here from Real Hauntings and you're checking them out, like and subscribe everything they do. They're good people. Madison was kind enough to come on our podcast a while ago, and it's been such a treat to reconnect. I heard about you then when she came on.
Yes.
So it's so great to meet you in person. And yeah, if you enjoyed what I had to say, make sure you check out Real Hauntings, Real Ghost Stories. You'll see the little ghost wearing headphones with a blue background, and that's us.
Yep. Make sure to follow them on all the social media platforms as well. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's episode. If you don't already follow us on social media, you can follow us at hauntedcitypodcast.com. And again, make sure to like and subscribe, all the good things. And if you have a ghost story, we are accepting ghost mail, and you can send it to ghostmail@hauntedcitypodcast.com. But with that, my name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Soucy.
And stay spooky, y'all.